sense.
Welcome to Eaters Enhancements, and today we're going to be talking about 300 blackout magazines. And this is going to be part one of a series of videos regarding magazines. But on this one, we're just going to touch up on what I know currently, the differences between a standard 5.56 magazine and 300 blackout, and what the differences are between the three that I've found on, which I know there's four, but these two are essentially count as one, the three different type of 300 blackout specific magazines that are currently available on the market. The three different ones that are available, at least that I know of, are the PMAGs, Gen 3s, 300 blackout magazines. This one's laser engraved with our pattern, but it is just a standard 300 blackout magazine. We've got Lancers. I do have other 30 round Lancers coming, but I'll get into these in a little bit. And then we have the D&H 300 blackout magazines, which once again we'll touch up on later. Now, the magazines that I have most experience with are definitely the PMAGs. These are my go-tos for 300 blackout. There are reasons why I don't go with the Lancers, and once again I'm going to touch up on those. But first things first, let's touch up on exactly what it is that's different between a 5.56 magazine and a 300 blackout magazine. Right here, this one's rattle canned, nothing special, it's just a Gen 2 5.56 PMAG. And let's get this guy taken apart. So now, the real difference between a 300 blackout magazine and a 5.56 magazine is really only the internal geometry of the magazine. There's nothing else that is different. What do I mean by this? What I mean is, specifically, I'm going to use a 300 blackout round. This shelf right here, this little bump, that little guy. Now, with a standard 5.56 case, the neck of the 5.56 will actually fall into there, but it really serves not much of a purpose other than, you know, keeping the 5.56 rounds stacked towards the rear because it's a good shoulder. 300 blackout doesn't have that much of a shoulder there, but it also does the other job of keeping the spring in place. What I mean is it acts like a spring guide. So if I were to take the back of the spring and insert it through, you can see that it does its job at keeping the spring from flipping forward and out of position. Now, the main reason why you wouldn't want the same size, because you can see that this guy is substantially shorter and not as prominent as this one is. Like I mentioned before, that's the main difference between a standard 5.56 and a 300 blackout magazine. And the reason why you would want this guy to be smaller is primarily for the stacking purposes of the 300 blackout rounds, because they are fatter up front. Now, that doesn't mean that all 300 blackout rounds need it, but if you simply eliminate how proud this guy is, you can run basically all 300 blackout rounds without limitations. That's not saying that you can't have a magazine that works entirely with those present. It's just they're less picky when that guy isn't as prominent. So let's give you an example of what it is that it looks like and what happens with the 5.56 magazines when you have a 300 blackout round. So when you have the first round, those guys don't even come in contact with the actual shelf right there. It only becomes an issue when you start stacking more rounds. So we're going to stack 5 rounds into this guy. And these aren't even that bad, but you can see how this round is perfectly true, but this one's being shoved in towards the center. And when I go to push it in, the first thing it wants to do is shove it towards the center. Now, that could be accounted as a good thing, because what it's doing is it's actually taking up space right here, and it helps keep this round from nosediving, but it also causes a severe amount of binding at the same time. So it may work, may not work for others. So what does it look like if we take this to a actual 300 blackout magazine? So let's reassemble this Gen 3. Okay, so we have a Gen 3. Follower is basically identical. There's really no difference in follower other than the color, and then it's not labeled 5.56. So we start stacking these 300 blackout rounds. And then when you go to push them down, it really doesn't change. It's very smooth, very easy to push in and out. It don't really wander around, and that's basically it. And it still has pretty decent support. So that's pretty much the difference, and that is the exact same difference that you will see between the 300 blackout PMAGs, the Lancers. Lancers have the same exact situation going, where they have a smaller shelf right there, and that is basically it. Even on the 300 blackout D&H, with the exception that the 300 blackout D&H actually has a different follower. Now, it's been my experience that this follower is absolutely garbage. They do have it labeled as a 300 blackout follower, and they do have a little bump right here, which I would assume it's basically for assisting the bullet and preventing it from nosediving, but it is not a full anti-tilt follower. It does have anti-tilt properties, but they're essentially made to tilt. They have a limiter to prevent full tilt, but it is still a tilt follower by design. And it's not great. I've actually given up after the first range trip because it looks very promising on the first round, but that's not good. I've actually had bullets nosedive with only one round in the magazine. It's terrible. I hate it. It's useless. It's pointless. Aside from the fact that they actually increase the space in here as they should have compared to a 5.56 magazine. These are basically useless out of the box. Not to mention that they don't fit in the lower. I had to file this one. I've actually had to like crush it a little bit because long ways they wouldn't actually fit at all. My guess is because they're taking standard 5.56 magazines and then they're essentially flattening this ridge on the inside, which is causing them to expand. And then they're not actually verifying that they actually bring them down to shape long ways, and that's why they wouldn't fit. How bad does this get? This bad. So here's another one that I had to file down, and I used aluminum black on it. I found better ways to compress these to size, but this was my first original attempt, so I removed the material till it fit. Not great, like I said. So that brings us to the only two that are technically well designed, and that would be the Lancers and the PMAGs. Now, I'm not a fan of the Lancers. Personally, I think they have some sort of issues, and that's part of in the rigidity department. Now, you would assume that because you have the steel feed lips that it's very rigid, and in a sense it is, but the biggest problem with the Lancers is this, how flimsy they are. Now, it doesn't look that big of a deal until you actually measure it with calipers, and they are just that flimsy because they're relying on this steel to stay stout, but it doesn't fully wrap around the front, so you just end up with this scenario where like you have a ton of leverage right here and they just expand. So this can cause all sorts of issues. We've had rounds being dropped from inserting the magazine, rounds being dropped by dropping the magazine, and then it's just, there could be ways around it, but if you start putting more spring tension into this, it starts spreading it out further, and it hasn't been great. But there's also another reason why these mags aren't great, and that's for some reason they have a lot more friction internally. Now, one of the other issues that I've had in general with 300 blackout magazines has actually been with when you have a really overgas system and really light mass. Basically what happens is the magazine spring cannot actually keep up with the feed rate of the bolt cycling. This is exclusively with the gun cycled for subs, or at least to be overgassed for subs, and then it's extremely overgassed for supers. And the only real issue that we've had so far has been the magazines keeping up. So that leads us to the next issue, which is even the 300 blackout PMAGs for 30 rounds have not been able to keep up. So you're like, well, so what's the solution? And the answer is actually quite simple for the time being, is if you really want something that can work really, really fast, you don't actually go with the 30 rounders or any Lancers. You go with the 20 round PMAGs. And you're like, okay, well, that sounds ridiculous. Well, it's a very simple answer as to why. And if I can get it, which you can already see me struggling, is because the 20 round PMAGs actually come with a 30 round spring. And that is fantastic, because the primary time where you have issues with these keeping up is actually on the last 10 rounds. So by eliminating the last 10 rounds and just having a full power spring, you essentially eliminate the feeding issues, because you have more spring behind it. So you're like, well, I'll just put a 30 round spring in the Lancer mag, in the 20 round Lancer mag, and you'd be like, well, yeah, that works, but this one comes out of the box with the 30 round spring, whereas you would have to buy it separately for this one. And then this one causes it to spread even further by the higher load, so I'll leave it up to you. But 20 round PMAGs keep up basically everything I throw at them. That's assuming the PMAG itself is good, but this one in particular has been perfect. It can absolutely keep up. You'd be like, okay, well, why don't we put a 40 round spring on a 30 round PMAG? Well, they fit, but you can't buy 40 round springs from Magpul unless you buy their 40 round PMAG. So it gets really expensive and not worthwhile. 20 round PMAG works great. Plus, if you're looking for a PDW, that's a great solution. Obviously, we're not done. This is not the end all be all. We're actually looking into it a bit further, because once again, we're not really done with our testing. Which leads us to the next part. And let's reassemble this guy. So, how do we eliminate the problem of the feeding issues on 30 round magazines in general? Well, the answer is quite simple. Increase the strength of the spring. There are a few companies out there that make springs. One of them is ISMI. They actually make, it's really inside this mag already, they make 30 round magazines that are extra power, and they are chrome silicone springs instead of the 17-7 stainless. Now, you lose corrosion, but you increase longevity. To me, that is worth it. I'm not really diving into the rain, water, or whatever. And you can keep the springs oiled, you just have to maintain them. Now, because these were so trash, I was considering just dumping them out, not doing anything about them. I'm like, we already spent money on it, so we might as well try to fix them. So they're usable. So going back to the DNHs, one of the things we did Magpul followers, which they work great on this magazine, but they still weren't able to keep up. So we still haven't tested it, but I've got some ISMI chrome silicone springs in it. You can see by the color of the spring, it is darker. So these no longer have the tilting problem, and they stack really well with your 100 blackout rounds. Now I also have some 300 blackout PMAGs that have this spring, so we will be testing these shortly, and we'll see how they respond. I'm a really big fan of aluminum or steel magazines, or metal magazines for that matter, primarily because, they won't have any feed lip deformation, and if they do, you can actually tweak them back into shape, because they sell those tools. So hopefully we can make something good out of this. And we're still kind of going through it. Hopefully we can offer it in the website whenever we do find an end-all be-all solution for 300 blackout magazines. We might have to even build our own. So who knows? I'm really hoping the PMAGs can be fully resolved by the springs, which, like I said, we do have some that are currently with those springs, but we haven't tested them. And it does make a difference. Like this follower substantially harder to push in. Not as hard as this one, but substantially stronger than 300 blackout PMAG. So now that we've covered that, there's also one magazine that I want to include in this kind of battle, which is kind of a known spring for most people, or sorry, a known magazine for most people. Now, one of the things that I was trying to solve with the spring is it's very limited space on what you can do in here, and then having to create your own spring in general is kind of a hassle. So the first things we always do in each of these enhancements is look in the market for something that is already present, maybe not advertised to do such, and that's kind of how our entire product line that is on our website is. We basically find items that are advertised to do something else that will achieve the goal that we want it to. And they're just basically that. Find what's on the market that can do the job that you need it to. Hence why we're looking into these still. But one of the limitations that we run into is that if we wanted to put a longer spring in the body, there's not enough room down here to do so. So one of the considerations was that we needed to come up with a dual spring setup. So before I even looked, well, I actually started looking into it pretty hard, but then I decided to just Google dual magazines or dual spring magazine, and something actually came up. The Torque Mag. Now, this is a magazine that's been out for several years now, and it's actually a dual spring setup. So there's actually a kind of like a tape spring or a clock spring in there that rolls up, and then there's a secondary spring on the back. And this gives you a ton of spring pressure without being ridiculous. Now, before I get carried away, that this Torque Mag is actually broken. Now, this was entirely my fault, so I'm not putting this against the actual magazine itself. This was from disassembly and then reassembly of this magazine. It basically it's very difficult to reassemble, and the only way to do the follower reassembly that I found was to completely unwind the spring until you can loop the follower in, and then you basically have to let it go. And I let it go, and it went warp speed in there, and it just basically shattered the follower and this little edge. Now, it doesn't appear to hinder function, so I'm gonna keep running it. But I did want to say that that break is entirely my fault and not the magazine's fault. So, and for testing purposes, I'm just gonna keep running it as is. I do have two more that are not broken, so just wanted to clarify that it is absolutely not Torque Mag's fault. So we'll keep running these. There's also other benefits to this particular magazine, which once again we'll be testing, and that is that the V-lips themselves are actually angled up. So if I were to insert one here, now there's another thing that this one does in particular that's better than the other ones, and that is that, number one, it does not use those little bumps in there to contain the spring. Actually, they don't really need them because of the dual spring setup, and then they do some other trickery in here to keep the spring from binding forward. But nonetheless, they figured it out really well. Now these are 35 round magazines, which are basically the same size. Not exactly, but they just have more spring available, or sorry, more room available because of the spring design. So if you look at the actual positioning of the round compared to standard magazine, you can see, not by much, you can see that the actual round itself is aiming slightly up, and that's good for 300 blackout because there are some rounds themselves that have a kind of a flatter tip to them, and this can definitely help with keeping the projectile in alignment better with the chamber, so that you don't run into nosediving issues with, or basically just feed ramp issues with your particular, like sub X, for example. Now, once again, we haven't really ran these. I want to test them, and we will be testing them, but so far, you know, they do seem to stack really well with no excessive binding. And they don't hold 35 rounds of 300 blackout, they do hold 34. But nonetheless, they seem to be pretty good. So we will be giving these a try. There was some binding on the inside based on like casting marks or whatever. So it is what it is. But so far they have really smooth feeding. And yeah, these may even work for 350 Legend. We're gonna give these a shot. I did speak to the owner of PMAG, and he said he's very curious in what we find out as far as its feeding speed capabilities. But you can see where the actual spring is actually holding on to the front. So yeah, we're gonna give these a shot, and we'll definitely report back on what we find if these are actually able to keep up. So yeah, that pretty much kind of sums up where we're at with 300 blackout magazines. We still have more testing to do. Like I said, even the DNHs are not fully out of the game yet, especially because the Nightfall followers exist and they are so cheap. So who knows, maybe we'll start carrying one of these on our website once we resolve all the feeding speed issues. Either way, we're gonna come up with a solution, and we'll let you know what it is. So stay tuned for part 2. Definitely subscribe if you're interested in the next part of the video. And if you'd like to support the channel, definitely go to our website. We have a lot of 300 blackout parts. We're also active on Reddit if you need help with 300 blackout cycling. Whatever you need, just hit us up on our website. I can't put links on YouTube, but pretty easy to find. Just Google eTrees Enhancements and you'll find the website basically immediately. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys later.